Good morning, everyone. May I have your attention, please? We want to welcome you to this 2007 series of the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus. As you know, we've had hundreds of briefings, and further briefings this year include malaria, breast cancer, obesity, diabetes, and we're going to have something on heart attacks. So if any of your offices has any particular topic of great interest, please bring it to our attention. You know, our co-chairs of this caucus, Lois Capps, Brian Bilbray, Congressman Rush Holt, and Congressman Mike Castle, helped several years ago to double funding for the NIH. Well, you know, this year is another difficult year for the NIH. This is a bipartisan issue, as you all know. And both the House and the Senate are trying through their appropriations committees to come up with sufficient funding so the scientists can continue their work. I don't need to explain to you as members of this caucus the importance of keeping the momentum going at the NIH for technological reasons, for health reasons, for America's leadership in the world. In any event, we want you to keep the NIH funding close in mind as you go through July and August in your offices, because there will be conferences and there will be many instances where you can come forward and do something to help. We really need to keep the money going to the NIH. This year, today, after 2 decades of research, discoveries have led to a vaccine intended to protect against infection from 2 types of human papillomavirus, HPV, that cause a majority of cervical cancers worldwide. Together, these 2 HPV strains are responsible for approximately 70% of all cervical cancers. Now, this cancer is very serious because it's one of the most second common causes of death in women worldwide. And it's responsible worldwide for about 240,000 deaths per year. In the United States alone, 4,500 women die a year from this cancer. We're privileged today to have with us a world-renowned scientist, Dr. Douglas Lowy. Dr. Lowy is the chief of the Laboratory on Cellular Oncology, National Cancer Institute at the National Institutes of Health. He's the deputy director of the Center for Cancer Research in NCI. He received his MD from New York University School of Medicine, and he trained in internal medicine at Stanford University and dermatology at Yale. He and his NIH colleague, Dr. John Schiller, conducted papillomavirus research together for more than 20 years. Their work has included the initial development, characterization, and clinical testing of the virus-like particle-based prophylactic HPV vaccine, a commercial version of which has recently been approved by the FDA. And I want to welcome at this time to our podium Dr. Lowy.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Congressman Holt. I need to apologize to you in advance because it turns out that the projector and the replacement projector that the AV people had is not functioning. And so I am going to talk to you without slides. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you about HPV infection and the papillomavirus vaccine. And I think that it represents a story that is a success story that the Congress, the NIH, and the biomedical research community can take great pride in, because it really is a result of steady support from the Congress that has led to major advances that now are having a clinical impact. I should point out that the views that I am going to be expressing are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of NCI and the NIH. And I also have a disclosure, which is that the NIH has patents on the papillomavirus vaccine technology, which it has licensed to Merck and to GlaxoSmithKline, which are the 2 companies developing commercial versions of the vaccine. And I am an inventor of this technology. So I'd like to tell you the story first of where were we 30 years ago with HPV. And I think that everyone agreed that HPV is not an important pathogen. It was a cause of genital warts and non-genital warts. And if we fast forward to today, we know, on the other hand, that HPV is an important pathogen, and it causes virtually all cases of cervical cancer, as well as a variety of other cancers. And last year, as Congressman Holt mentioned, the FDA approved a preventive HPV vaccine. And this vaccine has the potential to prevent about 70% of cervical cancer and about 90% of genital warts. How did we come to this situation? As Congressman Holt mentioned, cervical cancer on a worldwide basis is actually a very important cancer of women. And it's in many parts of the developing world, it's actually the most frequent cancer among women and the most common cause of death from cancer in women. In India, for example, it actually is the single most common cancer of men and women combined, although obviously only women get this cancer. In the United States and in other parts of the industrialized world, we have gone from being a high incidence country to being a low incidence country, largely on the basis of pap smear screening. But there still are a sizable number of cases of cervical cancer in the United States. It's estimated about 10,000 cases per year, and about 40% of the women who develop these cases are destined to die of their disease. In the United States also, there are enormous discrepancies or disparities between the incidence of cervical cancer in different parts of the country. And I brought with me a booklet monograph that was published about a year and a half ago by the Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities at the NCI, entitled Excess Cervical Cancer Mortality, a Marker of Low Access to Health Care in Poor Communities. And what you may see is that there are some areas that are in purple and others that are in white. And the purple areas have at least a 5-fold greater incidence of cervical cancer compared to the white areas. And these differences are largely attributable to access to medical care and pap smear screening. The fueling of the changed perspective for HPV has come from consistent long-term funding by public sector and nonprofit private sector agencies, but particularly from congressional funding, which was by far the largest source of funding for research. And the research really is in several areas. First, fundamental scientific research, as I'll describe in a moment. Second, for basic research on HPV, cervical cancer, and other cancers. And then third, for applied research on HPV vaccines. All of the HPV technology, the vaccine technology, was developed in the nonprofit sector. The pharmaceutical companies then have licensed that technology to develop the current cervical cancer vaccines, and they have done an excellent job in developing those vaccines. But I just want to point out that the scientific findings that underlie this are really the work of bench scientists outside the pharmaceutical industry. Then the support for that has come from the nonprofit sector, and particularly from Congress. So there actually are a lot of problems with trying to study papillomaviruses, because in contrast to many other infectious agents, you can't study papillomavirus replication in cell culture because of their peculiar features of their life cycle. And so the study and the advances of papillomaviruses really are attributable in large part to the developments in genetic engineering in the 1970s and 1980s. because it was necessary to use genetic engineering first to molecularly clone the HPV DNA genomes that then enabled researchers to study these viruses and ask, are they present in cancer? And without the genetic engineering and the ability to do this, this could never have been done. And the molecular cloning led to the identification that HPV could be found in virtually all cervical cancers as well as in a number of other cancers. In addition, genetic engineering permitted you to be able to express all the proteins encoded by the papillomaviruses. And this led to a really deepened understanding of how papillomaviruses cause cancer, also how in many situations they don't cause cancer. And finally, this also permitted the development of the techniques that have led directly to the HPV vaccines, the Merck vaccine having been licensed last year. So the cancers that are clearly attributable to HPV infection, cervical cancer, about 10% of cancers of women on a worldwide basis are cervical cancer. And virtually all, there are about 500,000 cases per year, and all of them essentially, at least 99%, are attributable to HPV infection. Anal cancers, also a high proportion. Cancers of the vagina, the vulva, penis, the mouth, and the oral pharynx, a variable proportion of those also are attributable to HPV infection with the same HPV types as found in that cause cervical cancer. And the basic advances, as I mentioned, first were the cloning of HPV 16 and 18, because together they account for 70% of cervical cancer. And then molecular epidemiologic studies showed that genital HPV infection is the most common sexually transmitted disease, that it is usually self-limited, but that it is persistent infection is what places you at risk of cancer. And when I say self-limited, I mean that the infection clears spontaneously. It established HPV as a necessary cause of virtually all cervical cancers and a variable proportion of these other cancers. Now, HPV 16 is really the very bad actor because it accounts for over half of cervical cancer on its own. And then 18 contributes another approximately 20%. But then there are a variety of other HPVs that then make up the remaining 30% of cervical cancer. The reason that this is important is that both the Merck and the GlaxoSmithKline vaccines target HPV 16 and 18, but don't yet target the other HPV types. So because the protection that is developed is largely what's called type-specific protection, it will protect predominantly against infection and disease caused by 16 and 18, but not against infection and disease caused by most of the other HPV types. In the United States, there are approximately 6 to 10 million cases of cervical infection per year in women. Most of these cases are subclinical. There are over 1 million cases of low-grade cervical dysplasia, about 300,000 cases of high-grade dysplasia, and as I mentioned, about 10,000 cases of invasive cancer. And the advances of the pap smear is to identify precancers, which then there is treatment for moderate and high-grade dysplasia, and then that is able to prevent the majority, although not all cases, of cervical cancer. So understanding the etiology or the cause of cervical cancer has led to two major advances. One, as I mentioned, is the vaccine. But the other is also the use of HPV DNA testing for cervical cancer screening. It was approved a number of years ago for women over the age of 30. The reason that it is not approved yet for women under the age of 30 is because the prevalence of HPV infection is so high that using this test would not really sort out people who are at high risk of persistent infection and progression. Whereas by the time women reach the age of 30, the prevalence rate of the infection is lower, and a much higher proportion of the infected women actually have persistent infection. And it's persistent infection, as I mentioned, which is what we really need to worry about. The vaccine has been tested thus far really in women and looking at the issue of whether it protects against moderate and high-grade dysplasia, which is the area that leads to treatment. But the vaccine has also been shown to have high protection against vulvar and vaginal precancers, as well as high degree of protection against genital warts. By high degree of protection, what I mean is close to 100% protection against infections attributable to the HPV types in the vaccine. And this has been seen for both of the vaccines from both companies. But as I mentioned, there isn't obvious protection against most of the HPVs that are not in the vaccine. As a result of understanding the causes of the causes of this cancer, one can envision perhaps in the future that we will be doing vaccination for young people because the vaccine is purely effective to prevent infection. And then for older people, tending to go away from routine yearly pap smear screening to doing HPV DNA testing as that becomes more common. And HPV DNA testing, particularly as women become older, has enormous both negative and positive predictive value for whether you are at risk of developing precancers and invasive cancer. The role of my lab in the vaccine development was primarily identifying that if you expressed just one of the proteins, the protein that makes the particle of the vaccine, that single protein would self-assemble by itself and make particles that looked just like the papillomavirus particle. But more important, if you immunized an animal with those particles, you induced very high levels of the kinds of antibodies that are called neutralizing antibodies, which are the cornerstone of most preventive vaccines. And we and others then went on to show that this approach was highly effective in animal models of papillomaviruses, and then that it was safe and highly immunogenic in people. And the GlaxoSmithKline and Merck are really the groups that have shown how effective the vaccine can be. GlaxoSmithKline's vaccine targets just HPV 16 and 18, so it's really an exclusive vaccine that's exclusively directed to trying to prevent cervical cancer. The Merck vaccine, in addition to having those two components, also targets two other HPV types, HPV type 6 and 11, and together they account for about 90% of genital warts, and so that vaccine can also, in principle, protect against genital warts. And as I mentioned, both companies have shown very high degrees of protection against the HPV types in their particular vaccine, but as I mentioned, not substantial protection against other types. So after there was regulatory approval by the FDA in June of this past year of Merck's Gardasil, the approval was for women between the ages of 9 and 26. The rationale here is that the efficacy trials were done in women between the ages of 16 and 26, and so efficacy was shown for that age group. In younger adolescents, what were done are what are called immunological bridging studies, which showed that the immunological response in young adolescents was actually even more robust than that in older adolescents, and this is quite commonly seen with other vaccines. There were similar immunological bridging studies done with young adolescent boys, but the FDA only wanted to consider approval in girls because there is as yet no demonstrated efficacy in boys. By contrast, the European Union also approved the vaccine last year, and based on the same data, they also gave approval for women between the ages of 9 and 26, but they also approved it for boys between the ages of 9 and 15. So this is a difference between the perspective in Europe and the perspective in the United States. Vaccine recommendations in the United States are made by the Center for Disease Control's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And because the vaccine is a preventive vaccine, and because women are at very high risk of acquiring infection when they initiate sexual activity, the vaccine target group is young adolescent women. And this is because the prevalence rate soon after women become sexually active can be in the 20 to 40% range. It's estimated that a woman's lifetime risk of acquiring a genital HPV infection is at least 75%. So that's why this is such a common infection. The advisory committee of the CDC also recommended catch-up vaccination for 13 to 26-year-olds. And for 9 to 10-year-old, vaccination is at the physician's discretion, and also recommended for inclusion in the federal Vaccines for Children's program so that children from low socioeconomic backgrounds would not be prevented or precluded from obtaining the vaccine. And indeed, the HPV vaccine is now included in the Vaccines for Children's program, which goes up to age 18. And the GlaxoSmithKline vaccine, they have applied both to the European Union and the FDA. They're actually meeting today with the European Union and hope to get licensure in the next month or so. And the FDA probably will be looking at licensure toward the end of this year or the beginning of next year. From a public health point of view, it's very important to recognize that women, even if they're vaccinated, must continue to receive cervical cancer screening for the reasons that I told you before, which is that although the vaccine does what it does very well, it doesn't do anything for women who are already infected, and it also doesn't do very much to reduce the incidence of infection for the viruses that are not targeted by the vaccine. So for the future, what might we envision first with HPV? I think first it would be important to have second-generation vaccines, first to protect against a larger proportion of the cancer-causing infections. If we could simplify vaccine production and delivery, that would also help in terms of reducing the overall cost. And it might also be useful to have an effective therapeutic vaccine, because the current vaccine, as I mentioned, is not effective in treating established infection. And at any given time in the world, there are 3 to 5 million women right now who are infected with HPV who are destined to die of cervical cancer at current rates of development of cervical cancer and current death rates. And finally, I think that this story of basic science that really has led to improved public health and the opportunities of public health can be replicated in many other situations. I know the cancer situation best, about 1 in 6 cancers are attributable to infectious agents. We already have a vaccine against hepatitis B virus vaccine, but Helicobacter pylori, hepatitis C virus, Epstein-Barr virus, human immunodeficiency virus, and human herpes virus type 8 are all important causes of cancer, as well as other important infections. So I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I've been able to convey to you that this represents a really a success story of long-term public funding of basic fundamental research that has led to important translational research and application by pharmaceutical companies that ultimately we hope is going to have a substantial impact on public health, and that there remains a need for improved interventions, and obviously the funding situation, we can only do as much as there is money given for. Thank you so much for your attention.
We would like now to entertain some questions. Let me ask you this question, Dr. Lowy. How do young men carry this HPV disease? How do they get it?
They acquire it from sexual partners by and large, and the infection is not limited to being penile infection, but it actually it involves the entire can involve the entire genitalia, and it's one of the reasons why condom use is not a highly effective protection against transmission of this infection, as opposed to some other sexually transmitted infections.
Can young men be screened for the HPV virus?
Yes, there are screening studies, and I should have mentioned that both companies are carrying out efficacy trials in men to try to establish efficacy, and I assume that at such time as they do, then they would go to the FDA, and the FDA would reconsider the issue of vaccination for males.
Yes. Just a second for the microphone.
Why was efficacy in males not tested in the United States in the first place? I assume it was tested in Europe?
No, efficacy has not been tested anywhere. I'm sorry if I conveyed that impression. It was simply the regulatory authorities in Europe felt that the immunological bridging studies, which simply look at safety and immunogenicity, that those studies in boys were adequate to give approval for immunization of boys. And the reason that it's largely an issue of priorities and expense. I think that the pharmaceutical companies wanted to make sure first that they had a vaccine that would be effective, and the most important target population is women, and the area where we have the most information is in women in terms of HPV DNA testing, etc. So it really was both, I would say, for scientific and medical reasons, and once that has been demonstrated, both companies, I mean, certainly Merck was very anxious to get approval for vaccination in males, and the FDA simply wouldn't permit it at this time.
Dr. Lowy, a man is a carrier of the HPV virus. Does he develop symptoms? Does he have cancer after a while?
Sure. The incidence of cancer attributable to HPV infection is substantially lower in men. The cervix appears to be at particular risk of developing cancerous changes caused by the HPV infection. Male homosexuals are at particularly high risk of developing anal cancer, for example, and anal cancer itself, both in heterosexuals, is largely attributable to HPV infection. About 50% of penile cancer is also attributable to HPV infection, but these cancers are just much less frequent than cervical cancer.
Yes, right here, Pamela.
Hi, two questions. One, as to whether there are any treatments of any sort for somebody who is infected, if not a vaccine, but any kind of therapies. And the other is, if the technologies that you developed are being licensed by the companies from the government, does that mean the government's getting some money back out of this?
Yes, the government does get royalties from this. The NIH has a strict policy of not informing inventors what the agreements are. Okay, so I can't tell you specifically what because I'm specific. They just won't talk to me about it because they keep us at arm's length in terms of. But yes, there are royalties coming in, and that should come in for quite a number of years. And as far as treatment is concerned, there are various treatments for precancers that are highly effective for trying to prevent the development of cancer. There also is effective treatment of cancer once it occurs, but it's much better to treat the precancers than it is to wait until the development of invasive cancer.
But something to knock out the HPV?
I misunderstood your question. There are at the moment no specific antivirals against HPV because there just have not, there hasn't been the effort that there has been, for example, say compared to HIV infection. In principle, there could be.
Yes.
I was just wondering what the incidence of illness, complications, or death are associated with the vaccination and testing and things of that sort?
Sure. There have not been any serious adverse events that really are attributable to the vaccine. I mean, what happens is if you compare the vaccine to the placebo, which is the vehicle that's used, the incidence of local pain is somewhat higher, and the incidence of low-grade fever is somewhat higher in the vaccinated group. But those are the principal differences.
Dr. Lowy, are you recommending that all young men also be screened and vaccinated?
Well, it's not my place, first, for recommendation. Second, in the United States, we don't yet have approval for vaccination for males. And I should point out that screening is not a prerequisite for vaccination, because vaccination, in order to be widely implemented, it's felt that it would be too complicated to screen people. And in addition, since the vaccine is a multi-component vaccine, it protects against multiple HPV types, even if you're infected with one type, the data actually suggest that you can be protected against the other types. So it basically, if people want the vaccine, usually, they basically it's just made available to them.
What is screening for HPV? Is it just a blood test?
So there is one approved screening test for HPV, and it's approved just in women. It's a digene test, and it basically tests for against a variety of HPV types that are associated with cervical cancer. There are a number of other tests that are in the pipeline and that probably will be approved over the next couple of years. But currently, that's the only approved test.
Yes.
As a woman who's planning on getting the Gardasil vaccination on Friday, I'm wondering whether or not you have any plans to somehow lower the costs associated right now with, or if there's anything being done right now to make it so that women like myself have an easier time getting approval, the insurance, or just the cost in general. Because I know right now the doctors are losing money by having it in stock. And that, if you're going to try to appeal this drug to low-income families, the 3 doses is definitely an issue, because that means going back to 3 times, 3 co-pays, and also the issue of again, the cost.
Sure. So it may not be an entire surprise to you that Merck didn't ask me how much they should charge for each dose of a vaccine, and I have zero control over that. My hope would be that with GlaxoSmithKline coming in as a second manufacturer, of the vaccine, that in order for that their pricing would be lower than that of Merck, and that there would be some competition then between the two companies. In terms of the 3 vaccinations, I completely agree with you, and we are doing and many other laboratories are doing studies to try to simplify delivery of vaccine so that fewer doses might be needed.
So the first discovery of HPV, the pathogen, is around just 30 years ago?
Well, I think that the key observations actually were made by Harald Zerhausen, who at that time was the head of the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg. And his group actually identified HPV 16 and 18, and that was in the mid-1980s. And prior to that time, it was very unclear whether HPVs were at all involved as in serious disease.
And the vaccine has been developed at the NIH?
Well, we made an important contribution to the development. I should also point out that colleagues here at Georgetown University, University of Rochester, and also in Australia have also been widely recognized for their contributions.
Yes.
How available is the test to determine which strain of the virus one might have, and how much does it cost?
Yeah, the current Digene test actually doesn't distinguish between HPV types, and there is a new test that they are developing and validating, which will distinguish between the HPV types. Once again, if they do develop it, they will not ask me how much to charge for it. And there are other companies that are also developing analogous tests that will actually do typing. I would guess that they would be in the $50 to $75 range, but that's a pure guess on my part.
But in the affordable range.
I think that it depends on how it really depends on how it's used and its frequency. That will go a long way towards determining its cost effectiveness.
Yes, over here, please. Just wait a second for the mic.
What types of research are being done to develop vaccines for the other strains of HPV, if any?
Well, the pharmaceutical companies are simply building on their success, which is that since the virus-like particles work so well, they just are going to be adding more particles from different HPV types in order to broaden the protection. That probably will work well in the industrialized world. My concern is that it will increase the complexity of vaccine manufacture and may paradoxically actually delay dissemination of the vaccine to the developing world, where 80% of cervical cancer occurs. Although both companies are committed to tier pricing, which is to charge less money in the developing world than in the developed world for the vaccine. In our own lab, we're taking a different approach, which is that we've identified another protein made by the vaccine, which at least in our preclinical studies suggests that it affords very broad protection in contrast to the type-specific protection. The disadvantage of the approach is that it's not as highly immunogenic as the current versions of the vaccine, and the current version of the vaccine really set a very high benchmark for effectiveness. But we're going forward to see whether that might work.
Congressman Bill Bray, are you here? Will you come up here and say a few words, please? Stay here, Doctor, please. Congressman Bill Bray is one of the co-sponsors and the co-chairs of our caucus. He's a congressman from San Diego. I've known him for years, and one of his tremendous assets is his unswerving loyalty and support of the NIH.
I apologize. I really just came to listen. I apologize for being late, but we have this little thing in Washington every once in a while where members of Congress are expected to vote, and they expected us to vote at noon. But I want to say sincerely, as we get into the discussion, I just wanted to listen because I think that one of the things as Americans in this new century that we've got to be very careful of is becoming so jaded to think that because we grew up with all these medical breakthroughs happening one after another, that we just expect it to fall out of the sky, that miracles are just an everyday thing. I mean, the astonishing accomplishments that research has made in the last, 30 years is just mind-boggling. You got to remember that when we were in school, the concept of a vaccine to fight any kind of cancer just was like, it was Star Trek material. In fact, speaking of Star Trek material, just to show you where our science is going, and to make you, especially those of you that are the young faces I've seen around here, I mean, just realize what a great period of accomplishments we have. They actually are working on now and have a working model. Remember the Star Trek, this next generation? I'm not talking about our generation of Star Trek. We're talking about your generation of Star Trek. Remember the guy with the glasses because he was blind? They have developed artificial eyes for the blind now, where they've actually learned to see again. And to talk to somebody who's learned to see to where he says, well, when I first wore it, the first couple of weeks, I could just make out a bowl and wouldn't know what's in it. And second is I could see that there was something in it. And then about 2 months later, all at once, I was able to see that there were plums in it. And I can tell the difference between a plum and a pear and an apple. And the fact of actually learning to see with a machine implants in his brain. I mean, this stuff is space age stuff. And I only bring that up because we should appreciate the miracle and then appreciate all the hard work, the investment, the huge amount of risk that people are willing to make with their lives and their money to create these miracles. And so I just would ask you, really do, as we hear about these great things, don't take it for granted that, let me just point out, I get in trouble for saying this. The outrage over a pharmaceutical company making money and making a profit. Where is the outrage when they don't make a profit, when investments don't come through? The huge risk there. And instead of being so upset at somebody making a profit, at creating these life-saving miracles, we should be celebrating the fact that that will be an incentive for more people to get involved in this process of creating miracles, to put their time and their money and their assets and their life savings into the concept that this risk is worth doing financially and personally because the miracles are so important. And so I just like to say thank you for everybody who's involved in this industry. I think you take too many cheap shots. People take you for granted, and I ask those of you in this room, don't ever take it for granted, the miracle workers who are out there every day creating the next miracle that you and I will be able to benefit from. But more importantly, that our grandchildren will be able to benefit from. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much, Brian. Dr. back here. Any further questions? Yes.
Oh, I'm sure you don't have any control of this anymore, but in terms of mandating the vaccine, as you know, the controversy in Texas, can you just speak about your personal opinion on that?
Sure. I think that there are really valid scientific questions for a new vaccine, for any new vaccine, in terms of it becoming mandatory in a short term. Because even though the studies are done on thousands of women, when it's very different to do it on that number versus immunizing hundreds of thousands or millions of people and making sure that the vaccine is safe. So, mandating a vaccine before a large safety record has been established, I think that is a potential issue. The second issue is duration of efficacy. As with any new vaccine, we don't know how long the vaccine will remain effective and when, if ever, people will need boosters. And we know the vaccine will work for at least 5 years. But I think that, once again, having a longer record of high effectiveness would also go a ways towards making it more reasonable to consider mandating it. But then there are lots of other questions in terms of whether you mandate a vaccine or not. One issue that I have read about in the newspaper is that some people have said that all of our vaccines that are mandated are against infections that you can acquire by casual contact. And that actually is not true. Hepatitis B virus vaccine, which is mandated, is not acquired by casual contact. So there is a precedent from that perspective. But I think that these are issues that are implemented by the states and are, really very complicated.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Lowy, for an excellent lecture. Thank you. Finally, we want to thank the Joint Steering Committee for Public Policy for sponsoring this luncheon. I want to say to you that our next briefing is not going to be until September, and I hope in the meantime you keep the NIH funding always in mind in your offices, and the briefing on September the 5th will be on the subject of a therapy for Marfan's disease. Thank you very much.